Hi, I'm Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty. Welcome to We Don't Have to Choose. Today, I'm excited to talk about our Conviction Integrity Unit. We can accept the idea that the system convicts people, but also makes mistakes at times. And so looking into past convictions is a good thing to ensure integrity in a conviction and to correct any injustices that occur. So I'm here with Claire Deagle, our Director of Professional Standards, and Claire and I had many conversations about the Conviction Integrity Unit because it never existed in this office. So can you walk us through the process of how we came upon this model? What did you do to explore what other states were doing?
Yeah, so fortunately, there is a lot of scholarship out there on conviction integrity units. The Prosecutor Center for Excellence has a lot of good material. The Quattrone Center, which is housed at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, has a lot of good material. So I started in looking at all of the scholarship on these issues, all the studies on these issues, and then talked to people across the country about what was working in their offices and what wasn't working. And so in doing that research, we came across a few different models, and we ended up choosing a model where there's an independent unit. Independent meaning outside of the criminal division. The head of it would report directly to you to ensure independence, and that it would be staffed by individuals who were not working on other cases in the office and who really had a lot of experience doing this work.
Why did you decide that that was the best model?
In looking at all of the scholarship out there, it appeared that the units that were most successful had this sort of independent model. And that's not because the folks who are doing the work are doing anything wrong or, not able to, identify issues, but just to ensure that there is a fresh second look. It seemed vital that the people working on the cases would be independent from the criminal division.
So when we decided on this model, or let me take a step back, actually. Let's talk about the Attorney General model here in Minnesota, which has recently been discontinued. But what were some of the major differences between that model and what we have?
The Attorney General's Conviction Review Unit was a statewide unit, so they accepted applications from individuals who had been convicted by county attorney offices throughout the state. But their model was premised on cooperation of the county attorney's offices in two important ways. First, the county attorney's office would have to agree to provide the case file, and they could make restrictions. For example, they could say, we're going to give you the full case file, or we're going to give you the case file without work product. The CRU sought the full case files because that's the best way to do a review of this kind. But the second way that they really depended on the county attorney's offices was if there would be a request for relief. So the Conviction Review Unit attorneys would come up with a recommendation. And if that recommendation to the county attorney's office was, this individual we believe is innocent and should be exonerated, they would make that recommendation to the county attorney, but they wouldn't be able to go into court necessarily and petition the court or agree to a petition for an exoneration for that individual. Ultimately, it was the county attorney that would do that.
And there's an important distinction there too. The county attorney can make that request of a judge. Ultimately, it's a judge that has to make that decision.
Yes.
And as you've described, the AG statewide unit could not go into court without the permission, or it really had to be the county from which the conviction came. They would have to go into court and ask for that conviction to be vacated.
Yes, so it was really a two-step process there. With our independent unit, and I know you'll talk about this with Andrew and Julia, that unit makes a recommendation to you, and then as an office, you decide what the office's position is going to be.
So when we decided on this model, we needed to figure out how to build it out, and probably most importantly, who we were going to get to build it out. So how did we go about hiring Andrew, who we're about to talk to?
Yes, so in speaking to people who ran other conviction integrity units, it became clear to me very early that we needed someone who was not only very experienced in criminal law, but in these post conviction matters. And so I started to seek out individuals with this specific expertise. I talked to people across the country, but we're really fortunate in Minnesota to have the Conviction Review Unit doing the work of the Attorney General's office, but also the Great North Innocence Project, who has been doing this work for decades on behalf of individuals who are wrongfully convicted. So I met with some of the lawyers there, and one of them was Andrew. And Andrew had worked on the exoneration of Marvin Haynes before coming here, and we had been very impressed with his work in that case. And we're very fortunate that he agreed to start the unit here.
Thanks, Claire. I'm here with Andrew Marquardt. I was just talking to Claire Deagle about Andrew, and Claire was singing his praises. So welcome, Andrew.
Wow, thank you.
Claire mentioned the fact that you had worked on Marvin Haynes' case, which was actually in post-conviction. Can you describe what post-conviction means?
Sure. Yeah, post-conviction is just a process for for challenging a conviction after the fact. So you've already gone through trial or a guilty plea. You've already done what you call your direct appeals, which is the opportunity to challenge sort of legal problems with the conviction. But then there's something new that comes up, and you want to get back into court. You want to do new factual development. So there's some new evidence. So it's a procedural vehicle to do that kind of thing. So innocence cases, other kind of wrongful conviction cases, that's what we're talking about is post-conviction litigation.
There's something very different, and we will be talking about this, about what the post-conviction court reviews and what we do, or Conviction Integrity Unit does with a file. And the court on post-conviction is bound by the transcript, essentially. And if it's presented with any new evidence. The court is not doing any kind of deep dive. Witnesses are not talked to again, additional witnesses. So that's very different.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where units like ours can come in and really develop cases beyond where they were before. And, and we have advantages, I know you talked a little bit about innocence organizations, including one that I used to work for, who do great work and can do a lot to advance justice on behalf of wrongfully convicted people. We, as a prosecutor's office, have unique advantages in a number of respects, including that we have the actual files. And where the prosecution files, we have easier access to police records and these kinds of things, and can, often find things in the record that may develop the facts beyond where they were before, that never would have been accessible but for the involvement of a unit like ours housed within a prosecutor's office.
So what made you leave the Great North Innocence Project to come here and lead this team?
Yeah, I mean, it was a hard choice, honestly, because I love doing that work, and I love my colleagues and the work that they do, and they play an essential role in this on these issues. I was excited by the prospect of coming to work inside the system for some of the reasons I was just talking about. There's just you have tools that aren't available when you're kind of fighting from the outside, that doors you can open more easily when you're inside the system, and hopefully promote justice, both in individual cases where something may have gone wrong, as well as more systemically. And that is another one of the kind of advantages of doing this work within a prosecutor's office, is it's not just about fighting kind of one case at a time to fix mistakes, although that's a huge part of what we do. But it's also about, what can we learn from these cases, and how can we apply that into the future to make sure we're not making those mistakes again, that the system is more just, more fair, more accurate, And that's a big part of the work we do as well.
And in a previous episode of the podcast, you and I talked about the fact that after Marvin Haynes and other cases, we were seeing a problem with eyewitness identification. And the research is pretty clear on that. But that there was an opportunity there to train our staff on best practices and also write a policy to help them, guide them in how to evaluate a case with eyewitness identification.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example of that, where we were able to see how things went wrong, learn from that, learn from the academic literature and studies out there, and put in place a robust set of practices to improve that, and hopefully not have Marvin Haynes type cases happen in the future. I mean, obviously, there's always going to be fallibility in our system, but there's much that we can do to learn from past mistakes and make the system better.
So let's talk about the process. How does somebody apply, and then what does your team do?
Sure. So our process is primarily driven by applications on behalf of people who have a conviction in Hennepin County, most of whom are incarcerated, although technically they don't have to be. And they're writing into us and saying, hey, I believe something went wrong in my case. That could be that they are actually innocent. They played no role in the crime whatsoever. And that is kind of the core, the most central type of case we're interested in. But it may be some other form of injustice that maybe they played some role, but it was a lesser role, or they were over sentenced, or their rights were violated in some way. And then we take the application. We'll do kind of a preliminary review to try and get a sense of what is this case about, what materials are out there, what are the issues, is this the kind of case that lends itself to a factual reinvestigation? Because that's not every case, for different reasons. But if it is, then we do a deep dive, and top to bottom review our full files, police files, do witness interviews. And I know Julia, our investigator, will talk a bit about what some of that looks like. Do, where it's appropriate, do DNA testing or other forensic testing, consult with experts if there's some issue where that's relevant and informative. And then, when we've kind of done this whole process, decide what we have. Like, is there some basis, a really compelling basis for us to support some kind of relief?
So,
and sometimes there is, and many times there's not.
So I wanted to circle back because I think this is an important difference. Sometimes people say, oh, this person had plenty of appeals, and the Court of Appeals in Minnesota, the Supreme Court, upheld their conviction. And I think this is where it's important to talk about the difference between what an appellate court is looking at and what your team is looking at. We talked about that before. So the appellate court is restrained by the transcript from the trial.
Right.
But you just talked about the fact that your team is looking at police reports. You're looking at the entire file that the county attorney has. You're looking at transcripts, you're looking at interviews, and there is an opportunity to go out and interview other people or do some type of forensic testing. So it is very different from what a court is looking at on appeal.
Yeah, it's very different from direct appeal, where, as you said, the court is really looking at a paper record of what happened at the trial, and are there sort of legal mistakes in there. Whereas we're talking about developing new facts through new investigation. And I would say even, you will have cases where individuals have done prior post-convictions, which theoretically could be used to develop the facts, but oftentimes they're unrepresented. Those typically are not based on the kind of robust reinvestigation that we're doing.
So we meet once a month, and you give me updates on where the process is on these cases. We also have a dashboard as well. Can you describe that?
Yeah, so something we're really proud of is, one of our offices broader values is a commitment to transparency wherever we can make information more readily accessible to the public. We want to do that. So we have a dashboard for our conviction integrity unit, which has all kinds of information. Now it's not about, you can't get case specific information. It's kind of aggregated information, but there's quite a bit there in terms of where types of cases, the crimes involved in the cases we're looking at, where cases stand in our internal process, demographic information, age, race, kind of statistics, whole bunch of information that gives a pretty good glimpse into the types of cases that we're looking at, and I think goes well beyond what any other office has made publicly available. So encourage people to check it out. There's quite a bit there.
What are the various types of conclusions you draw?
In terms of like how we
Yeah.
resolve cases?
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, so many cases we end up closing pretty early on. Probably about a third of the cases we don't do the kind of deep dive for one reason or another. They just don't lend themselves to that. In terms of the cases where we do go through that full process, which is very timely or time intensive.
Because you're looking at thousands.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, these are really robust investigations. So we may get to the end of that and say, we think this person was innocent, in which case we would recommend you, and if you agree, our office would support an exoneration, which a judge, as we talked about before, would have to sign off on. Can't do that unilaterally. We may find some other really significant defect where we think maybe we don't think this person is wholly innocent, but we really can't, in good conscience, as ministers of justice, stand behind this conviction, at least not in its current form. So we may support some kind of reduction in the sentence or some kind of other resolution where they're not necessarily exonerated, but they may get a lesser sentence of some kind. Or we may have, there are cases where we go through the review and we think, this conviction really does have integrity, and we do essentially do nothing. And we've even in that latter category, I mean, we've even had cases where we've done this investigation and we found new evidence of guilt. So, we come out with even greater confidence in the conviction that we went in with. And that's great too. Like, I mean, the point of all of this is not to get into any kind of preconceived notion about what result we want, or it's really to follow the facts and do what's right and just based on the facts that we learn, and with the hope being that this process will, as a whole, promote confidence in the integrity of the work this office does.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about one issue that comes up. We've had some community events, and they're almost always family members there who have a loved one behind bars who may have has applied to the team, and we don't share information from that person's case even to family members. Can you talk about that? What? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's tricky, and we have to be very respectful of the fact that we're dealing with sensitive information on behalf of individuals. So, if someone applies for us to review their case, we are not going to be sharing their information with anyone without their permission. So, we are able to share information with family members and loved ones, partners, with applicants' permission, but they do have to grant us that permission expressly. So that it's an important part of our process.
Yeah, and a lot of the people who apply don't give us that permission, and I think it's fair to say that there are people in prison who are really wanting to maintain their innocence to their loved ones, but that we may see I mean, I remember this particular issue coming up that, sometimes a person on the inside will say to their loved ones, I've had perfect,
Mhm.
I've never been disciplined, that kind of, or just tell them things about how well they're doing in prison. And they have all kinds of different reasons to do
Mhm.
that. But we know from looking at the record that that isn't entirely accurate.
Sure.
Understanding why they do it, but then we can't share that with loved ones. So I think there's that tension where loved ones feel this frustration of, I'm hearing this from my loved one, and yet you are not granting relief of any kind.
Yeah. No, I mean, what you're describing is real and can certainly come up, and it's tricky. And I've had many conversations with loved ones of people who are applying, um, and I have, we have a lot of empathy for that. It's a very hard position to be in, um, and I think it can be hard for them to appreciate some of the sort of legalities of some of the things we're doing. But I want to assure people that we're here because we know that these injustices do occur, and we take them really, really seriously. We have a limited staff, but we're working very hard to try and to investigate these cases and bring them to just results. But I know it can be very frustrating for people who are fighting these fights on behalf of loved ones.
Speaking of wonderful staff, I'm going to be talking to Julia Merritt, our fabulous investigator, and I know she won't say this about herself. Can you talk about her background a little bit and how lucky we were to get her?
Yeah, no, we are extraordinarily lucky to have Julia as part of our team. So she came to us from New Orleans, where she was doing similar work on behalf of the Civil Rights Division in the Orleans Parish DA's office, and had done work in capital cases before that, and just has an enormous wealth of experience and is very skilled, and has been a real asset for our team and for this work in Hennepin County.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
I'm here with Julia Merritt, and Andrew just described Julia as having come to us from New Orleans and being just an outstanding investigator, which is true. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how what it's like to be investigating a case that may be decades old.
Mhm.
How do you approach it?
Every time you start with a lot of reading. We locate all the files, and up here, there's always more files than there ever were in New Orleans, I will say. And we read everything, the internal case files, the police reports, the appellate file, anything and everything we can get our hands on. And after we finish that and identify any potential red flags, then we get some more files and we read some more, and just do an incredible amount of reading before we start interviewing folks.
Then how do you decide who to interview?
I discuss it with our team. After we've split up all of the workload, we come up with a plan. Before we start interviewing anybody, we reach out to the victims' family members to let them know what's happening, and also sometimes to get their take. And then we just start knocking on doors.
Well, let's talk first about what it's like to reach out to victims. I can
Yeah.
imagine that's really difficult because this is
Yeah.
something that happened years ago and they thought it was behind them. So what is that
Mhm.
like?
Yeah, it is difficult. It is really difficult. It's difficult for them to get that call. It's difficult to make that call. It's difficult to have the meetings. They're often very emotional meetings. But I think it's important for our team to be there and to meet with the victims first, to know sort of what's at stake with that family. And sometimes, those meetings can really surprise you, and you can get actually information about the case. Sometimes the victim's family had doubts of their own. So
And then you mentioned you go out and knock on doors. How do you
Mhm.
actually find people when it's decades after?
so any investigator uses databases. We have the same law enforcement databases that the police use. So as long as you're able to find identifiers from the old records of your witnesses, you're usually able to track them down and find if not a right address, an address for a family member, and or a working phone number, and you go from there.
So do you send out a letter or call or just show up?
Sometimes I do all of those things. It depends on the witness. It depends on the reason that we're interviewing them, and it depends how long it's been. Some folks we send a letter to first because we think it's a softer approach, but other folks, letters don't work, and then we just show up and knock and start talking.
So I imagine you've received many different kinds of receptions. Can you talk about that?
That is definitely true. Sometimes when you knock on a door, people don't answer. Sometimes they answer and you wish they hadn't because they yell at you. And sometimes they invite you in and you end up sitting and talking to them for hours. I think part of being an investigator is being able to go with the flow and meet people where they are. Everyone always says that. And just be open to whatever people want to share or not share, and go at their pace.
Do you run into the situation where they don't really remember what happened or they don't
Mhm.
remember what they said?
Yes, yes, especially the old cases. We look back at cases from the 90s and 80s sometimes. Almost everybody on a case that old is going to tell you right off the bat they don't remember anything. But once they start talking and sharing things, they realize that they actually do remember a lot. Of course, sometimes folks don't, and especially if they were going through drug addiction at the time, sometimes you just don't have those memories anymore.
So what do you do with that information that you gather?
Bring it back to the team, write up a report, discuss next steps, and mostly leave it up to the attorneys to decide what to do with it.
What do you find rewarding? I'm assuming you find this job rewarding. What do you enjoy about it?
I enjoy the puzzle of it. I enjoy spending time with people, talking to people, helping them through difficult conversations. And I do enjoy the reading and the organizing, going through old case files. I think pretty much anyone would think this was a really cool job.
Is there a particular case that you've worked on that you found to be really rewarding in any way? You don't have to identify the name of the case, but something that was really interesting and fascinating, or something you learned something about.
Yeah, one of the cases that we worked on, one of our exonerations, was one where I was preparing for an interview that I thought was going to be really difficult. That I thought the witness was going to be hesitant to share, and not open to our investigation. And it ended up being that, for lack of a better word, that was the easiest interview I've ever done. So I've certainly learned not to make assumptions, and that sometimes what you expect turns out to be the opposite.
Why was it the easiest interview you've done?
Because she confessed to actually doing the crime.
Yes,
Mhm.
I remember that case. Well.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that certainly that's something that happens on TV, but
Yeah.
it just doesn't happen in real life very often.
Not very often, no.
Thanks, Julie.
Thanks.
You just heard from Claire, Andrew, and Julia talk about our Conviction Integrity Unit. It's a team that we're really, really proud of. They've spent a lot of time, as you can see, doing deep dives into many, 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 many records and transcripts. And what they've done is pretty extraordinary in a short time. They have recommended exonerating some people, and that has actually happened. And there's really nothing like standing next to somebody or hearing about somebody who is being released from prison because they did not do it. But I also understand that that's a heavy burden. We have taken away time from their lives. So it's important to get it right. One of the other things that our Conviction Integrity team does is to take a look and see if there are some recurring issues there that we need to address as an office, meaning like eyewitness identification. What kind of best practices do we need to train our staff on? What kind of policy do we need? And so that's one of the reasons we don't have to choose between conviction integrity, where we are checking in on cases to assure the public that they either have integrity or they don't. Thank you for joining us.